The Secrets of Middle-earth is brought to you by the StarQuest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give.
You're listening to The Secrets of Middle-earth, where we discuss the hidden themes and deeper layers found in the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, whether in his writings or in any of the media derived from them. I'm Thomas Salerno, and joining me today on the panel are Kaitlyn Facista. Hello, Kaitlyn.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And Thomas Sanjurjo. Hi, Thomas.
Hi, Thomas.
And Jeff Haecker. Hey, Jeff.
Hi, Thomas.
And be sure to follow The Secrets of Middle-earth on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or any directory or app. And you can find us on social media at facebook.com/StarQuestMedia, or on Twitter, where we are at SQPN, or on Instagram, where we are at StarQuest Network. Now, today we are talking about the Lords of Arda, the Valar. But before we dive in, as we're recording this, some new information came out that apparently Warner Brothers and New Line Cinema have just struck a deal that would allow them to create new movies set in Middle-earth, apparently independently of what Amazon is doing with Rings of Power. Now, my first thought was, well, that's great news for the podcast because it means we're going to have more Tolkien cinematic content to review in the future.
But I just wanted to talk about.
Exactly. So I just wanted to throw out to the panel, what do you guys think about this announcement? They're thin on details yet, but what's your gut reaction?
I'll go first.
Okay.
I just, as long as they don't try and do like a reboot, I'm really worried about them like trying to say, oh, let's do an updated version of something. And it's like, no, there's just don't touch the stuff that's already been done because it's varying levels of good, but it's done.
And I think I heard that they're not even going to consider that it's just going to be new material. Perhaps set in the same universe, maybe not, but we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited for it because, as I've said multiple times, the films are kind of my entry point into really becoming a fan of Tolkien. So I'm hopeful that they'll do something good with it. I know there's been lots of different varying pitches for spinoffs of both of Lord of the Rings and other things in the Legendarium. So I think one that's been around for a while was like a young Aragorn show or a young Aragorn something, or even something about his father, which I think there was a fan made movie about Aragorn's father that came out a while back.
It's on YouTube, I think.
Yeah, I haven't watched anything, but yeah, something like that could be cool, or seeing like some, maybe some of these other parts of the War of the War of the Rings could be interesting. And I did read something, I think that Peter Jackson is a consultant on it. I could be wrong on that, but I think he might be somehow involved at some level. So
there's lots of great stories that could be made into really epic movies. My worry is that they try and get too big with them. Like, I want them to focus on tiny little things like the story of the Black Blade and just following it along. That would be really cool. Like, that would be a really neat plot point, and just follow that. Just it. Don't, it's going to get into the wars. It's going to get into all this other stuff, but that should all be backdrop to like just following the Black Blade, or little things like that you could do. You could just really take like 2 or 3 kind of throwaway lines from the Silmarillion and just blow it way out and make a huge epic tale out of it. And that would be really neat. And I'd love to see it in different directors' hands too. I think that would be a lot of fun to kind of see like different takes on the world, but with that sort of cohesive concept of what Peter Jackson kind of did with the original movies.
See, I would really like to see different, like completely different approaches, like different artistic styles, different types of movies. Like, I know the War of the Rohirrim is going to be animated. So like, jumping into all different kinds of animation styles. Like, I don't want it to feel like the Marvel movies, like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, you know, where everything fits together. It's all the same style. It's just basically like you're watching, it's almost like a TV show at this point because there are so many of them. But I would really, really like to see just different people just having their shot at it and seeing what they come up with and not feeling the need to be consistent. But I get how it makes sense that it might probably be consistent, but I don't know. I just think it would be really cool to see.
No,
I think
definitely.
Tolkien-esque is my requirement for though. That's my worry. It's like if you give too much creative license, it's going to end up being this kind of deviation from the original, like the high fantasy of Lord of the Rings. And that's what I really want preserved, is that more like elves are archetypal. And even if you take that and you like really push it to its boundary and say like, okay, well, what if we had an archetypal bad guy elf? That's cool, but you want to maintain that consistency of like elves aren't living in the dirt. That's not how the elves are. And because then you end up like looking like, okay, well, elves, dwarves, and humans, that looks just like The Witcher. So where do we differentiate the two? And that's one thing I think that The Witcher has done this really cool thing of carving out its own space of it's grimy, it's dirty, it's real, and it doesn't feel the same as Lord of the Rings at all, which is really interesting because it's got the same essentially, you know, palette of characters to work with.
Yeah, it's definitely got to have that Tolkien feel, right? Like, which I think for all its flaws, you know, Rings of Power, you know, usually hits very well, you know, of being that kind of high fantasy setting and having that feel and those themes that resonate. So yeah, I don't know what to think. I'm just hoping they don't overplay it because every franchise like this risks franchise fatigue. And that's probably like, okay, I'll never get tired of watching Lord of the Rings stuff, but I just feel like somebody on Twitter, I wish I could attribute this to who this was, said like, it's like Bilbo said, it'll become stretched like butter spread over too much bread. You know, if we start, I know that there's a ton there in the Legendarium to work with, but I don't know how much Warner Brothers and New Line have access to and what they can do. I just worry about them stretching it out. And
I feel like we can see that a lot with like with Harry Potter and the way that every bookstore that you go into now just has like Harry Potter stuff. Like there's so much merchandise. Like you can have a Harry Potter anything like and it's just like so overdone. And I really, really don't want to see that happen to the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien in general, where like it just becomes so cheap when there's just so much merchandise out there, so much media to consume. Like it's just too much. So I would hope that they would kind of be prudent in what they do decide to put out.
And Harry Potter's just become even bigger than Harry Potter because now the brand is the Wizarding World, not Harry Potter. Right. So
will we see a Lord of the Rings theme park in the future?
I mean, I'm down for that, but
well, if they do, we need to have a live recording episode there. We all meet up.
Instead of the Tower of Terror, it's Barad-dûr, and you take the ride down.
That would be
anyway.
Awesome.
So yeah, as soon as more information comes out about that, you know, on future episodes, we'll be talking about it as soon as they announce stuff. So we'll definitely be following it. But for tonight's discussion, we are going to talk about the Valar. And I thought this was a good idea because we reference the Valar a lot on this show. And for listeners who are kind of just discovering Tolkien's world, either through the Rings of Power, or maybe because, you know, it's the 20th anniversary of the Peter Jackson trilogy, maybe they've watched those for the first time, or who are just picking up Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, you may not know who the Valar are, and to hear us constantly referring to them could get a bit confusing. So I figured it would be good to just kind of have this discussion and break down these characters and talk about who our favorites are and why. The Valar are mostly found in the pages of Tolkien's Silmarillion, although there are references to them here and there in The Lord of the Rings, especially in the appendices. But particularly in the Ainulindale, which is Tolkien's creation myth, and in the Valaquenta, which is a section of the Silmarillion that basically breaks down all the Valar and who they are. And Valar means power, as in angelic powers. So these are gods with a small g, as you might say. They are angelic beings that are created by Iluvatar, who's the supreme creator god. And they were there when Arda, the world that Middle-earth exists in, was created. And the Valar are part of this angelic order of beings called Ainur, and they entered into Arda because they wanted to have a part in its shaping, in its creation. And now, at the time of the Lord of the Rings, they live separately from Middle-earth in their own kind of sequestered land called Valinor, and they exist as kind of these sort of high kings and queens of Middle-earth, which actually makes me think, when did you guys first become aware of the Valar in your kind of Tolkien fandom?
Well, for me, I mean, you hear about Elbereth pretty close to the beginning of The Lord of the Rings. And so that, I guess, was my first introduction to them. And I don't think you learn a ton about the Valar at that point, but that was my first time hearing about her and thinking, like, who is this? And then, of course, you go to look it up, and then you kind of stumble down the rabbit hole and begin learning all about them. If you haven't read the Silmarillion before, which most people usually start with The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings. So I imagine that's kind of how it goes for everyone.
Yeah, I think Elbereth was the first. Elbereth Catholiel. That's the first introduction to me, because I on my first read through, I was just so enamored by the random things that were the real stuff of the world that Tolkien built that just fell into your lap while you were reading and was mentioned once, and then it was like assumed that you just knew who this was, and so I was like immediately like trying to find in the appendices where this person is and what this is that they're mentioning, and trying to figure it out, because there's so many names that it's easy to just say, forget it, I'll figure out who this is later. But yeah, I remember finding that one especially because it was such an important character. It was such an important figure for Aragorn. Like, it was somebody that he looked up to. You could tell that it was somebody that was a point of admiration for him, and for him to be the guy, you know, like the High King, and have this person that inspires him. It's like, okay, well, I gotta know who this is.
What about you, Jeff? When did you first find out about the Valar?
Yeah, I'm sure I'm not the best reader. I'm a fast reader, which isn't always the best, because I'll just get to go into start skimming and be like, because I want to see the action, and it's not the best way to read Tolkien. So probably when I read Lord of the Rings, I didn't really catch any of that. It probably was the first really awareness I had was probably when I read Lord of the Rings, and then I kind of started looking stuff up about the world and the legendarium outside of what's in the Lord of the Rings, or whenever I actually read the Silmarillion and read the Ainulindale and the Valaquenta, and actually get to see who all these Valar are. So I would say mine was when I actually went and read the Silmarillion. So a little bit more direct than than the others, but
It's crazy, though, to think about people who are coming to Tolkien through the Rings of Power, because Aule is probably the first of the Valar that they're learning about, because he's getting his name dropped left and right in the show. And so, like, I don't know, it's interesting to think about the perspective that they're going to have going forward.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I don't think the Valar are ever mentioned in the Peter Jackson movies, unless I'm quite mistaken.
I mean, we hear about Morgoth, but he's not counted among the Valar anymore.
No, yeah, right.
So I guess not.
And it's interesting because, like, the way I first encountered them was kind of different, because, like, when I first started getting into the Lord of the Rings when I was a teenager, I had this book called A Tolkien Bestiary by David Day. And I know people have opinions about David Day's books. I get it. But that was one of the first Lord of the Rings books, like that, kind of ancillary, world building books that I had. And I remember just devouring it and reading everything. And I'm like, oh, there's all this other stuff. There's Valar and Maiar. And I remember just like attempting to memorize that entire book. And that was how I first like encountered those characters. Only much later did I read the Silmarillion and get their backstories in context. And that was kind of a revelation, because the Silmarillion is so great. And once you get all those characters in their stories, it's just a whole different experience than just knowing the names and like facts about them. But speaking of names, I gathered a list here, thanks, of course, to the Valaquenta, but also thanks to Tolkien Gateway. Just to double check my work here. There are 7 lords and 7 ladies of the Valar, and I'm just going to run through them real quick, because in a second we're going to spotlight our favorites. So I think that the listeners should first know who's in play here. So for the lords of the Valar, at the top there's Manwë, who's also called the Elder King, and he's the Lord of Airs and Winds. He's essentially Ilúvatar, God's kind of vice regent over Arda. Then there's Ulmo, who's the Lord of Waters, and he lives alone, unlike a lot of the other Lords of the Valar who have spouses. Ulmo lives alone, and he's one of the most like involved in what's going on in Middle-earth. Then you have Aule, the smith of the Valar, the maker of the dwarves, and a very poor judge of character, apparently, which we'll get into later, I think. Orome, the huntsman. He was the first to encounter the elves. There's Mandos, who's also called Nemo, the doomsman of the Valar, who rules over the halls of Mandos. There's Lorien, also called Ermo, the master of dreams and the brother of Mandos. And finally, of the lords, there's Tulkas, who's their champion. He's kind of like, I've heard him described as the bro of the Valar, because
Accurate. Totally accurate.
That is very accurate.
Yep.
And we can't forget the ladies of the Valar. As you mentioned earlier, Kaitlyn, Varda, who's also called Elbereth, is the wife of Manwë and Queen of the Stars. I believe one of her other names, Gilthaniel, actually means like star kindler or something, which is just beautiful. That's great. There's Yavanna, the giver of fruits, who is the mistress of plants and animals and the husband of Aule. Nienna, the lady of mercy, who is the sister of Mandos and Lorien, and interestingly, the teacher of Gandalf, which is a very important character detail. Este the Gentle is the wife of Lorien and a healer. Vaire the Weaver is the wife of Mandos. She weaves tapestries of time and fate. Vana is the wife of Orome and the younger sister of Yavanna. She's another sort of nature-oriented Valar. And Nessa the Dancer is the wife of Tulkas and sister of Orome. She's also kind of another nature. There's several among the Valar. There's several women who are nature figures, which I found is very interesting. And Melkor, I guess, used to be counted as one of the Valar, because you see him in lists sometimes, and sometimes he's not. But of course, Melkor.
He's an interesting one though, because he was a Valar before they came to the world, because once they come to the world, he comes in kind of just wreaking havoc. Like that's his whole thing, is like he just wants to destroy things. And so, but then there's the question of like, at what point was he not doing exactly what he was designed to do?
I don't think it's, I don't know if I'm wrong, but I don't think it's that he's like his nature has changed and he's somehow not one of the Ainur anymore, but it's that he's just not counted among them. I don't know if that.
Right.
Yeah, I think I agree with that.
Yeah, he likes to still call himself a Valar, though. I think in the Children of Húrin, when he's having his dialogue with Húrin, he still calls himself a Valar, and Húrin kind of mocks him for that. Because he's kind of let most of his power flow out of him into his various creations and monsters and stuff. So he's become way less powerful than, say, Manwë or Aule or one of the others.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
But of course, he's the guy who later becomes Morgoth, the Dark Lord, the first Dark Lord, and does various things, in Middle Earth, kills the two trees of Valinor, and well, for more, just read the Silmarillion, because I'm not going to spoil it all here.
Simple as that.
Simple as that, exactly. So
here's I've got to, before we go into specifics, this is one of the things that has always bugged the heck out of me about the Valar, right? For all of the Scandinavian rich tradition that builds the Lord of the Rings, right? There's the trees, there's the elves, there's all of these spirits and everything. It is very clear that the Valar are Greek god adjacent, right? Like they are not the same as Odin and Thor, and Tulkas is the closest you get to like a Scandinavian adjacent god here, and that's the bro Thor kind of figure. But none of them have like any direct correlation, at least in my mind, to Scandinavian gods, where very clearly Mandos is Hades, Manwë is Zeus, Olmo is Poseidon. You can almost draw each one of them to a Greek equivalent. And
Aule
it's always bugged me.
What's his name? Aule is the
Hephaestus.
Vulcan. Or Hephaestus, yeah.
So like what was going on with this is so bizarre, and like I've always wondered about that aspect of the gods essentially in the Lord of the Rings. It's just so weird.
Yeah, I've wondered about that because I remember reading somewhere that Tolkien himself was not too keen on Greco-Roman mythology.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't really like it, or Greco-Roman culture. So yeah, I wonder why they're so similar.
I mean, Mandos lives in a cavern and is protected by his dog. Like, how much more Hades can you get than that, And it's, I don't know. So I don't know. Before we go to the favorites, that's why I just had to throw that out there because it's always bugged me.
Point.
I love it, but
it just kind of shows it's kind of a mix of varying traditions because obviously as we discussed a couple episodes ago, Tolkien was writing from his very Catholic Christian perspective, but then he's bringing in, as you said, the Greek, the Greek gods are under the one god, and then in the world is very Scandinavian. So he's kind of drawing from these, from a Greek, a Scandinavian, and a Greco-Roman kind of perspective. So I guess it's just kind of, he's like, I like this aspect, and kind of mix them all together. So
Yeah, I like that though, because I feel like if he would have been drawing too much from only one culture or mythology, it would have been really easy to make everything into an allegory. And this gives everything so much more depth and richness. And it just makes it more fun to read, honestly.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I like that. I think he wanted to maybe not make it a one-to-one thing of Scandinavian lore. So he kind of makes the higher sort of spiritual beings seem kind of more other from that to give them a sense of etherealness, perhaps.
And it's interesting too, because like if you draw the parallels down a little more, the Scandinavian gods tend to be more the elves. Like the elves themselves tend to follow a lot of those tropes of, the way that they approach the world and the way that they kind of deal with things. It's a lot more in that sort of Acer kind of vein of things, so like the tree, they're very involved with the tree. They deal very closely with the tree in a more worldly way. But I just find it interesting that he like put the Greek gods in this higher aspect for him. So yeah,
they definitely don't have the lecherous personality of the Greek gods, though.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. That is a fair point.
Because, like, Greek. Okay, I had to read a lot of Greek myths in high school. And while I enjoyed them immensely, it's also like, wow, there's parts of this that are really disturbing. And you don't get any of that with the Valar. Like, the Valar, yeah, I like that they're this kind of fusion of kind of like the archangels with Greco-Roman kind of imagery. And I like what you said, Thomas, that the elves are kind of the Scandinavian figures, because Feanor definitely has the personality of a Scandinavian demigod.
Absolutely.
The kind of tragic, hard-headed figure where I'm going to do what I want and damn the consequences.
Our stories will be written to the end of Arda, right?
Right. Oh, yeah. It's a great line. Yeah. But yeah, I guess now we can transition into who exactly are our favorite Valar and why. Jeff, why don't you go first?
Yeah, so it was a little hard for me to pick, and we were kind of talking beforehand, so we didn't all pick the same one. But I went with Ulmo, Lord of Waters, and I just think first of all, he lives in a palace under the ocean, just somewhere that probably no one else is. He just hangs out in this like cool water palace all alone, which I think is pretty cool. And I also like the fact that he uses the rivers and the other waters of the world to kind of gather news and hear about what's happening in Middle Earth. And he's also one of the Valar that's if he's not the closest, he's one of the closest to the elves and humans, of knowing what's going on with them and like wanting to kind of help them out. And he's very present in several specific instances where he saves somebody, or he gives somebody through his servants, gives some suggestions that lead to like he says, hey, maybe you should build this city here, or do this or that. And so I just think that's really cool of him. And he has horns called, or I guess they're conch shells called Ulamuri, which is fun to say. So, but yeah, I just think he's I don't know. He just seems to be pretty cool. And like I like the water. I live in Texas, not near any water, but I like the water and going to the beach and stuff. So, so yeah, I think I like Ulmo the best. But he's close with Manwë for me. But yeah, Ulmo's just a cool water guy. So
Ulmo's a great choice. Yeah.
I really love the fact that he never abandoned Middle Earth. Like when all of the other Valar are kind of holding back more, he seems like he was always a lot more invested and less willing to leave the people behind and leave everything behind.
And I was doing a little bit of brief reading and beforehand, and he was, I guess I'd forgotten that Morgoth was afraid of Ulmo because Morgoth was afraid of the water, because it was kind of an untamed wild thing, and Morgoth was all about taming and control. So he was always afraid of the water.
Yeah, and I remember hearing somewhere that Ulmo remembers the music of the Ainur the best of all the Valar. Like, he remembers the details of the song the most closely, and that it's echoed throughout his waters, whether it's the ocean or rivers or streamlets or what have you. I thought that was a really interesting concept.
Mm-hmm.
It's also very cool in the way that Melkor does meddle within the music, the way that it has an effect on Ulmo's water when he's creating super hot heats and very frigid cold weather. Like, Melkor thinks he's going to be ruining everything, especially the water. But instead, that's how we get snow and rain and frost and mists. And so, like, that's just their relationship there, and the dynamic is really interesting.
Yeah, I think Ulmo understands the nature of the music to be just wild and free and flowing, and that's kind of reflected in all the things that he's in charge of, which is just the passage of water through the world.
Yeah, like there's this great I think it's because I've been reading the Fall of Gondolin over the last couple of weeks, rereading it, and there's this awesome piece of art in it by Alan Lee, where it's this terrific painting of Ulmo coming up out of the ocean to like talk to Tuor, and it's like if I could get that, like poster sized for my wall, that would be awesome. Like, yeah, Ulmo's great. It's just whenever he shows up in the Silmarillion, the story is going to be advancing in interesting directions.
Yeah, and he was the one who basically led to the Valar coming to Middle Earth to aid in the War of Wrath, because Arundel's wife, he saved her, and she gave Arundel the Silmaril, which led to him kind of getting passage into Valinor to plead their case. So almost kind of he's on the side of men and elves and all noble beings. So I think that's really he made an island, a giant island boat to get people to get elves across the sea. So, which I think in some of the other material, he may have had a giant whale or whales helping him push that island along. So,
which is great. You never know what to expect with Ulmo.
Yeah, exactly. And who doesn't love whales and sea creatures?
So Kaitlyn, who's your favorite?
Sure. So for my favorite, I chose Varda, also called Elbereth. I think the first reason really is because she's the first one that I ever got to meet. Like I said earlier, we see her in The Lord of the Rings pretty early on when Frodo and Sam are at the beginning of their journey, and they come across the elves and they're singing a hymn to Elbereth. But I also think she is really cool because you get to learn more about her, and she actually knew the mind of Melkor before the music of the Ainur, and she had like already rejected him at this point. And then he has this like, it says in the Silmarillion that he feared and hated her most out of all of the Valar. And I think that's just like a really intriguing dynamic in terms of the story. But we also see a lot of Marian attributes within her character. Especially her intercession on behalf of the children of Iluvatar. I think it's really, I don't know, it's just a really sweet character. And I love the way that we have the stars and her connections to the light of the world and the heavens, and just the way that especially the hobbits call to her in their need. And it seems like she's always listening, and she's always there to help them out. And I think that she's just really cool.
That was a good choice. And I think like the admiration that all of the characters have for her is really cool, because it's just she's powerful, but in that quietly powerful way, where it's not that she's, master of the oceans or the creator or the judge or whatever, but she's almost the creator of stars. I think that's sort of her thing. And it's these silent witnesses and light in the darkness. Those are her kind of motifs, which I really enjoy about her.
Yeah, and I do like her intercessory power and how the elves and the hobbits and some of the men just really reverence Varda and that she created essentially the constellation of the Big Dipper, which they call the Scythe, I think, to be like a sign of doom to Morgoth. And that's why it's in the north, because that's where Morgoth had his fortress of Utumno. And I'm like, that's a really cool detail. I like that she has this cosmic power.
She's very, very powerful. But yeah, like you said, very quiet. But just something very strong about her and unyielding. I think she's a really cool character.
So what about you, Thomas? Who is your favorite Valar?
Right. So I had to pick Mandos because I love the concept of the Hall of the Dead and the way that death is dealt with throughout the Lord of the Rings is just so amazing. The depth that it is given by having all three of the main races have a different relationship with death, not only in how long their life is, but in what happens to them after they die. And the way that builds through the story. So my just major props to Tolkien for creating this incredible version of a very just but not a judgmental Lord of the Dead, essentially, which is what Mando's main focus is. And I really like the fact that his wife is the weaver. And by the end of Arda, she has woven tapestries that cover the entirety of the halls of Mandos, which is kind of like, it harkens back to the concepts of folklore where there's someone weaving the world, you know, that concept of the fates where the tapestry is being woven around everything and every person has a place in the tapestry. And also that concept of like, it's never finished, like the job is never done. And so she's continuously weaving around this place that he is holding the dead and calling them to. So yeah, I love Mandos. And then my favorite part of all of that is that he's like the voice of Manwë. So he does the dirty work, right? Like proclaiming the dooms. And, you know, because it's not the thing you want to do. You don't want to be the guy that's like telling everybody, and this is how it's going to go down. This is how you're going to fall. Because especially not if you're the leader, you don't want to be the person that's out in front doing that. So you kind of assign it to your right hand guy, right? Like, it's like, here, could you just go take care of this for me? And, but he does it, and he does it in a way that's like really powerful. And so all of the dooms that he proclaims are, they're just the truth. This is what's going to happen. Not that you're cursed in that sense of like everything's going to befall you, woes upon you, and you're awful. And, you know, but no, just look, you've made a choice. This is what's going to happen. So every time he proclaims it to him, it's because it's a problem that person, group, whatever, has brought upon themselves by making a choice. And so he's just informing them what that choice means, like pushing them out into that choice and saying, here you go. You chose this. Now here's what's next for you.
Yeah, I like his title of the Doomsayer.
Yeah.
It's just really cool. And I like how you don't see him very often, but when you do see him, you know stuff's gotten real.
Mm-hmm.
And he has a couple of funny moments too when Feanor is losing his mind in Valinor, and they ask him for the Silmarils, and he's like, you know, if I give you the Silmarils, I'll be the first one to die here. And then Mandos is like, not the first, because he knows that they've already been taken, you know, but and that his father has been killed, but they don't know yet. And then after Feanor leaves, he's like, Feanor is gonna come to me soon. You know, like he's just
right.
he just knows. He tells it like it is, and he just knows what's going on. He seems to be a lot more aware of that than anyone else.
And two, he kind of figures in Beren and Luthien's story, right? Because Luthien goes directly to him to advocate for Beren's release and her, you know, being re-embodied.
And he takes pity on her too, which is not in his character. You know, he's the judge. He's the he weighs the right and the wrong and what a person or an elf or anyone what their the culmination of their life is. And with her, he listens to her and makes a decision based more on kind of what she's bringing to him about someone else, which is interesting.
On that, there's also the aspect of Beren and Luthien needed to have kids so that we could, you know, gradually get to, you know, and these nobler men by introducing that, you know, by intermingling the elven and the human races. So there might have been a little bit of Iluvatar telling Mandos, hey, you should probably you know, let Beren out. Just let him go. So
Okay, so for me, it had to be Aule. And I like Aule for a few reasons. One, because he's the great sub-creator of Middle Earth. He's kind of the creative spirit. He's the most who kind of wants to imitate his father, Iluvatar. And just because that chapter in the Silmarillion where he creates the dwarves and he has that dialogue with Iluvatar is probably hands down my favorite chapter in the Silmarillion. And since he's such a huge part of it, like I can't help but love the guy. But I also love that he's flawed. You know, he has a couple of glaring character flaws that, like, he's impulsive. You know, he creates the dwarves without anybody's permission and without consulting anybody. And he's also, you know, not a great judge of character, because among his students are Feanor, Saruman, and Sauron himself.
Yeah. And the Noldor in general.
Right.
Yeah.
They didn't do too well.
But he has these flaws, but I think that just makes him to my mind, a more interesting character and more, he's the most human of the Valar. You know, even the little things where, like, he's discussing the dwarves and the Ents with Yavanna, his wife. And she's like, you know, well, like, I had to petition Manwë and Iluvatar to create the Ents, because otherwise, yeah, the elves and men and your dwarves are going to cut down all my trees. And he's just like, they're still going to need wood, and goes back to his work. And it's just like, which is just a human thing to say. You know, I just really like his character, and I like that he represents kind of the creative spirit. He's the craftsman, and kind of all artists and craftsmen, artists of any kind, can kind of, in Middle Earth, can kind of take Aule as their patron. And I really kind of identify him, especially when he's offering up the dwarves to Iluvatar. He's like, you know, these are the work of my hands, and I offer them to you, my father, not as being in competition of you, but he says, like, you know, any child would want to imitate his father. And that's just so touching and moving. And that's why I really like, Aule's my guy, I think, out of all the Valar.
I'm really glad someone chose him, because he's one of the most awesome. But I mean, they all are, so it's hard to choose.
Yeah, he was up there for me too. So
they're all great. Yeah, I wish we knew more about some.
Nobody went to Tulkas though.
He's kind of a fan favorite. I understand.
If you can only choose one, though, I don't know.
Yeah.
Tulkas is just like, he's a meathead, man.
He's just like strong, and that's it.
I've kind of heard it said he's like the professional wrestler among the Valar. He has that kind of larger than life personality.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And he uses no weapon, which is interesting. He just wrestles with his bare hands.
I mean, he's really cool. I just when I'm thinking about my favorite, it's never going to be him, unfortunately.
Right. I wish we knew more about some of them, because some of them, like, you know, Vanna and Nessa, to me, are almost like interchangeable. That we know very little about them beyond their names, and that they're kind of nature oriented.
Mm-hmm.
And so Tolkien seems to have fleshed out some of them more than others.
Yeah. Yeah, some of them just ended up naturally more involved in the story that he ended up writing.
maybe that's where some of these movies could come in. Is
I was about to say the same thing. Like, hey, there's some room for exploration here.
They end up like the Eternals or something, you know, like this kind of big over the top superhero movie starring the Valar. No. Can you imagine?
No.
But you know, in all seriousness, it might be fun to take some of what has been done with the Valar that we do know, and then repeat a sort of mirror image of it, right? Because we know a lot about the Noldor, but there are other brands of elf, right, that we could definitely get more story out of. That would be really interesting, and maybe they attached to some of the other Valar in a similar way that the Noldor attached to Aule.
Yeah.
And I mean, there is kind of room, because in the very early Silmarillion, when there's like essentially no elves or men or anything else, it's just the Valar fighting Morgoth. So you could kind of do that story. There's not a whole lot of detail about it, but it would definitely be like huge and over the top because everybody is overpowered being angelic beings and such. And there's a lot of drama too, because what is it? Morgoth, he crashes Tolkas and Nessa's wedding and destroys the two lamps and stuff. So yeah, there's like, which essentially creates the continents. There's this whole, you know, the fight between these people creates continents, which is insane.
Yeah, that would be very intense.
Yeah.
Ooh, I'm like seeing a Fantasia style like romp through some of the Silmarillion stuff. That would be really neat.
Oh, yeah. An animated kind of Fantasia set to music would actually be really, really minimal dialogue or no dialogue and just set to music would actually be really, really cool.
Yeah, that would be really neat.
There you go. We're writing this stuff for you, WB. Look.
Call us, you know, Warner Brothers. We have ideas for you. But we've done something really fun for this episode, which is that so Kaitlyn created this really neat Valar name generating system. And the four of us have used it to create our own Valar names and have come up with like, you know, essentially little bios for these people that we've created. We've kind of done the first like D&D step and kind of created our character. Which I just thought would be super fun for each of us to have our own Valar. So kind of going in reverse order from last time. Thomas, who's your Valar? Who'd you pick?
All right, so mine's weird because the first three letters of my name are weird. So I kind of just juked it together a little bit. But Fondos, which will be the same as yours, I assume. The Lord of Puzzles was mine because I'm very much into puzzles and just cryptic mysteries and solving things. I like going down that path. So I was imagining Sandos, the Lord of Puzzles, being a somewhat of a trickster Valar, where he encounters and provides riddles. Like he would love hobbits, very much love hobbits because of their interest in riddles. And he would arrive and introduce ideas to mortals and guide them along paths where they had to solve a problem, and they would have to figure something out, come up with a solution. And that was that's his call. But I definitely think that there would be some interest there in the riddle combat between Smeagol and Bilbo when they encountered each other. And I imagine he is the one that made that such an important part of the story of the ring.
Like chaotic good Loki. I like it. I really like that. And I like how you sort of weaved it in where like he has a kind of subtle influence on the story, like a lot of the Valar do.
Yeah, they just, there's like little tidbits of them in there. So yeah.
So Kaitlyn, who are you? Who's your Valar?
Okay, so mine would be Kavana, creator of, and then this one was tricky because I don't really have a favorite hobby. And so I would say Twitter. That's so embarrassing.
Creator of memes, perhaps?
Creator of laughter.
Oh, creator of laughter.
Terrible content.
Yeah.
So I guess, I don't know, my Vala would just be messing around and keeping things light and kind of rejoicing in community. I don't know.
No, I like that. I think that's neat to have kind of a Valar of joy, of laughter, who kind of makes it her business to go around spreading positivity, kind of.
There you go.
Throughout
Yeah.
Middle-earth. I like that.
But not too serious.
Right. Doesn't take herself too seriously. Exactly. I like that.
Her favorite quote is, "This speech is too long. Limit it to 140 characters."
Right. Too long. Didn't read.
She has a little
She's
bird
the
she
most
sends around.
she's the most meta of the Valar. And like
right.
all the others are just like, what? They're like,
everything I say has 8 layers to it.
Right. All right, Jeff. So who are you?
All right. So I had a little trouble coming up with what he is the lord of, because I think it was the last thing you bought, which was beer. So I instead of just focusing on beer, I went with Jeff say Lord of Merriment, and I'm kind of including feasting and having responsibly having a good time with your friends with good food and good drink. So I kind of like to think of him as kind of like a Saint Arnold, kind of like he's the patron saint of, or he's the patron Valar of brewers and anyone who because I like to cook, and I like to eat, and I like to have a good beverage every now and then responsibly. So I think he's kind of, and so the hobbits really love him. He's kind of their even if they don't know his name, they kind of invoke his spirit every time they're together and feasting. So yeah, I think he's just kind of the one that's there anytime there's people having a good meal or good drink or just a good time together over a cup or a table. He's there hanging out with them. So yeah, so he's the Lord of, like I said, I think I'm going to say Lord of Merriment, so that it kind of encompasses beverage and food. So
so like a more responsible version of the Greek Dionysus.
Yeah, exactly. Like I said, he of course ensures everyone's having a responsible time, and not going over.
The hobbits say it comes in pints.
Exactly.
That's great.
He created the pint for them, so
right
there you go.
Like the Valar of food, cheer, and song, as they would say.
Oh yeah, that's perfect.
That's a better way to put it.
So mine is Thaule, giver of books.
Oh, that's good.
And I envision him as the scribe and archivist of the Valar, who taught writing and bookbinding to the elves. And I had this cool idea where kind of inside, he has this mantle, but inside the lining of the mantle are these pockets where he keeps scrolls and books that he's constantly pulling out and either giving to people who need them or just reading them. And I have this idea that he is friendly, but somewhat absent-minded, because his mind is always on some book he wants to read rather than where he is in the middle of doing something. So
a constant smudge of ink somewhere on his face.
Yeah. And I imagine him having like this magic like quill pen. I don't know what it does, but I just imagine that kind of being his tool.
That's very cool. I like that one.
That's awesome. That's so creative.
Yeah, and that one would just perfectly came out of me picking the things off this. And we'll definitely have this little creator thing in the show notes so that our audience can use it. And yeah, guys, definitely tell us who your Valar is. If you use this thing to create one, send the name and your Valar's attributes to us, and we might read the most interesting ones here on the show. That would be really cool.
Did we explain what this is before we started doing this?
A little bit,
sort of.
Yeah. You created it, Kaitlyn, so maybe you should explain what it is.
So it's a little graphic. It's kind of like you see them floating around Facebook where it's like, pick your rapper name and it's like Lil whatever the last thing you bought. So this is pick your Valar name. And so you start out with the first couple letters of your name, and then you add your birth month, and there are different endings, like January is Way and October is Ulcas. And then there's a little prompt for your favorite Tolkien book. So like if your favorite Tolkien book is The Hobbit, you would say who delights in ... And then it's different for each different Tolkien book. And then at the end, it is your favorite hobby / activity or your last purchase. So it's kind of complicated. You probably need to see it on the little graphic. But
yes,
I realized halfway through this, I was like, did we tell the people what we're doing?
Just making up our own, just wholesale.
Yes. So it's fun. It's we'll have a link to it. You can make your own Valar name.
Yeah, definitely. This was a lot of fun, and it kind of reminds me of what the Secrets of Star Wars panel did, right? Thomas, with creating
where
their
they got to
own,
make their own characters,
characters, and they had the T-shirt too. Maybe we could have like a T-shirt where it's us, but as our Valar that we've created.
Yeah,
I've wrote these names down, so like
an elf with a Rubik's cube. That's
yeah,
I'm in.
So yeah, Dom, take note. Future merch, perhaps. The panel as Valar. That would be
that'd be
awesome.
really cool.
I like it.
So did any of you guys have closing thoughts on the Valar before we end tonight?
I think anybody who hasn't read the Silmarillion and is still wondering, why these kind of things are important, definitely go in and read it, because the world building that Tolkien did for the Lord of the Rings is so impressive, and the understanding that he had of these kind of concepts. And the really interesting thing to me is that at no point do these characters supplant the concept of God and the fact that Middle Earth is Earth and God is still God, and these figures are real. If you want to take the legendarium at its value, these figures are real, but they're not gods. They may have been worshipped as gods, but that didn't make them God. And they all knew the true God, right? And they all knew of him and what his purpose was, and all served him. And even when they were doing things like speaking doom, it was out of the sense of what they were inspired to do by the one true God. And it's such an interesting take, because you don't get many fantasy novels that don't have their own pantheons that are subject to something real and true like that. And so I really like that about this. It's the Valar are such an interesting set of figures, and they just thread that needle of deification so well, so that they're very powerful, but at the same time they're not the ultimate powers in the world that he's created.
Yeah, that's a good distinction to make. Yeah, they're very similar. Actually, I just remembered they're very similar to C.S. Lewis's Eldil from the Space Trilogy. And I often wonder whether there was a little cross-pollination there between the two friends, because the Eldil are very similar. There's usually one like high Eldil and Oyarsa who's set over each planet, and he kind of has his own little servants, almost like Maiar. So yeah, I wonder if there had to have been, because Lewis mentions Numenor in one of those books. So there was definitely some. Yeah, he mentions it in That Hideous Strength. He mentioned and he even says, for more about Numenor, check out the books of my friend J.R.R. Tolkien. And it's like, and none of the Numenor stuff had even been published yet. So, but there's definitely really cool. There's definitely some cross seeding going on between those two, which is brilliant.
Well, and for it to come from like just these kind of odd throwaway bits in the Bible where it talks about powers and principalities, right? And that's what the seed for these kinds of characters is that they are the powers and principalities that govern kind of ethereally what's happening in the world. And, angelic beings, like just to say that that's what they are angelic beings, is interesting. And then also very weighty, because like to take that concept from a Christian perspective and put it in this other creation that's not Christian, but is clearly Christian, right? and to be able to do that in a way that doesn't make it like forced and weird. It's so clever. It's amazing the way that Tolkien was able to put these things together and make them mean so much, and still be so analogous to things that we had in the real world.
Okay, so yeah, I did definitely pick up a copy of the Silmarillion to learn more about these characters, because they're so fascinating, and we could go on forever about them. But that's it for this evening. And before we end, we'd like to take a moment, of course, to thank our patrons who make this show possible, including Michael F., John M., Maureen, Suzanne S., and Adam S. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give help us to continue to create The Secrets of Middle-earth and all our shows at StarQuest. And you can join them at sqpn.com/give. And again, we'd love to hear from you guys. We love feedback. Which of the Valars your favorite? Have you created your own Valar? Let us know. You can contact us at sqpn.com/Middle-earth or on our Facebook page or on Twitter, or you can send us an email at middleearth@sqpn.com or comment on our YouTube channel. And you can visit our channel on the StarQuest Discord server at sqpn.com/Discord. And we'll be back next time when we'll be discussing motherhood in the Legendarium of Tolkien. Until then, Jeff Haecker, thank you for joining me and sharing the secrets of Middle-earth.
Thank you, Thomas.
And Thomas Sanjurjo, thank you as well.
Thank you.
And Kaitlyn Facista, thank you also.
Thank you.
And I just realized we probably should have outroed with our Valar names, which would have been much better. I'll remember next time. Once again, I'm Thomas Salerno, and thank you for listening to The Secrets of Middle-earth on StarQuest.
Here's another show on the StarQuest network you're sure to enjoy, The Secrets of Star Trek. Find it wherever fine podcasts are found or at sqpn.com/Star Trek.